What's up, YouTube? It's the one and only Legend of Winning, aka Low, and this video is long overdue. For the past couple of years now, as I've been pretty active in the NBA community, the one thing that I have seen from many NBA fans is the discussion of where certain players rank all time. A conversation that I am extremely intrigued with because you start to realize what people deem as valuable throughout players' careers. But unfortunately, as time continues to pass us by, people start to become misinformed on certain players' impacts in league's history. And easily the player that immediately comes to my mind who falls victim to misinformation or rhetoric that is completely based in fallacy is Tim Duncan. Tim Duncan is one of the greatest players of all time, and I don't really think too many people debate that. However, the arguments that I hear about his career in an attempt to marginalize what he achieved, my goodness, it's mind-numbing sometimes. So in today's video, I'm going to shed some light on some of the misinformation that is constantly spewed about Tim Duncan. Now, the first myth that I have to dispel about Tim Duncan and his career is this concept of him not being dominant, which is amazing to me because on the surface, when you look at Tim Duncan's accomplishments, they should really speak for themselves. We're talking about a player who was selected to be an All-Star 15 times, selected to 15 All-NBA and All-Defensive teams, 2 regular season MVPs, 3 Finals MVPs to go with his 5 championships, and a player who has recorded over 25,000 points, over 3,000 blocks, and over 15,000 rebounds. But yet, for whatever reason, people still make this argument that he isn't quote-unquote dominant, or that he wasn't dominant enough for them to put him higher on their top 10s list. But even with the accolades and stats out of the way, I do believe that a huge reason why people make these claims is either A, they're just young and don't recall Tim Duncan dominating in the early 2000s, which is something that is definitely noteworthy because most of Tim Duncan's most impressive feats were accomplished within his first 10 years in the league. So yeah, if you're young, you're just not going to remember that. But also, and more importantly, when it comes to dominance, for whatever reason, people tend to immediately try to correlate dominance with how many points a player is scoring. And when it comes to Duncan, he ended his career with an average of only 19 points per game, and throughout his prime he was only able to have an average of over 25 points per game once. However, that ideology is flawed for multiple reasons. For starters, Tim Duncan was active during the slowest pace era within the last 50 years of basketball. And not only that, he was playing on one of the slowest teams during the slowest pace era within the last 50 years. So there just weren't that many possessions for Tim Duncan to consistently average 25 points per game. However, I mean, if you look at Duncan's scoring averages, we're talking about someone who was averaging roughly around 22 to 23 points. So trying to marginalize what he accomplished when it comes to scoring just because he was off by 2 or 3 points is a bit of a stretch. But what's even more undeniable is that Tim Duncan's dominance was more so felt on the other side of the floor because defensively, Duncan is one of the greatest players the league has ever seen. I don't really like using defensive metrics largely because they are a massive misrepresentation on the impact that a player can have defensively. But even if I were to do so, Tim Duncan's defensive metrics are godlike. Everything from defensive ratings, defensive win shares, his on and off numbers defensively, and even if you want to just look at something as simple as blocks, Tim Duncan actually holds the record for most postseason blocks in NBA history, and I would deem it's an unbreakable record because the next player on that list is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and even the gap between Kareem and Duncan is a noticeable one. And then after that, we're talking about Dwight Howard or Anthony Davis as the only other 2 active players on that list. And yeah, I highly doubt they're going to pass Tim Duncan anytime soon. Also, when it comes to unbreakable records, another one that Duncan holds is the most all-defensive team selections in NBA history with 15. And the only reason why I'm able to confidently state that no one is going to be able to surpass that is because A, you would have to at least play in the league for 16 years, and B, you would have to play at an elite level defensively from the beginning of your career as a rookie, which has only happened 5 times when a rookie was named to an all-defensive team. Those 5 players are Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, interestingly enough, Manute Bol, and of course, Tim Duncan. Yes, Duncan, as a rookie, was selected to an all-defensive team, all-NBA team, was an all-star, even received some MVP votes, and led the league in double-doubles. as a rookie. So again, this concept of Tim Duncan not being dominant is amazing to me. And also, if you are someone who is looking for some more dominance offensively, just go look at Duncan's postseason numbers. Unlike a lot of other players, Tim Duncan's numbers actually went up during the playoffs, especially his scoring numbers. And keep in mind, for the most part, we are not discussing a player who was getting knocked out in the first round consistently. Now, the second statement that I constantly hear about Tim Duncan in an attempt to discredit what he accomplished throughout his career is that Tim Duncan received too much help, which is so laughable on so many levels, but yet still so disappointing, because for whatever reason, and I just don't understand this at all, so many people have failed to realize that there's absolutely no way that anyone would ever achieve the amount of success that Tim Duncan received throughout his career without having some help, let alone the amount of help that he had throughout his career. But even that amount of help, in contrast to a lot of other all-time greats, really is not as much as many people are trying to make it out to be. Now, when people make this argument, there's normally two sides of it. First, you have the teammates, and then you have the coaching. So let's tackle the teammates first, and then we'll talk about Popovich later on. First, when it comes to the teammates, people always reference the Hall of Fame talent that was constantly surrounding Tim Duncan, in reference to Kawhi Leonard, David Robinson, and of course, Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili. First and foremost, and I discussed this in the previous video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but the Hall of Fame argument is literally the most ignorant argument that is constantly used in the NBA community. Stop being lazy and acting as if like players who eventually made the Hall of Fame were all playing at an elite level throughout their entire careers. It is just factually incorrect. It's ridiculous when people do this, especially in reference to Tim Duncan's teammates, the most noteworthy ones being Kawhi Leonard and David Robinson. Granted, more people are starting to recognize how foolish this statement is, but let me just explain it to everybody else, because I don't think everyone thoroughly understands this. Kawhi Leonard was not in his prime when he was playing alongside Tim Duncan outside of possibly the 2016 season, and that's it. And then when it comes to David Robinson, thanks to a back injury that shortened his prime and the same injury that positioned the Spurs to draft Duncan, he was no longer the same player either. Granted, both of these players are, or at one day will be, Hall of Famers. However, the accomplishments and statistical accolades that were received and earned throughout their careers that gave them the Hall of Fame status was done while not being Tim Duncan's teammates. I don't understand why I have to stress that enough to people, but again, my goodness, it's just ridiculous how simple-minded some people can be. But again, most people understand that. But when it comes to Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili, this is where, again, my mind is just blown, because as great as Tony Parker and Ginobili were, and I'm not trying to marginalize them at all, but I mean, let's just call a spade a spade. I don't know how that's too much help, especially when people casually put players such as Magic Johnson, Kareem, Larry Bird, and Shaq above Tim Duncan. And in those conversations, nobody never ever states anything about any of those players receiving quote unquote too much help. But the thing that blows my mind even further is that I don't think people thoroughly understand that Tim Duncan won a championship before Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili on the roster, and the second championship that he led the Spurs to, Tony Parker was a sophomore and Ginobili was in his rookie season, further proving that he didn't desperately need Ginobili and Parker to win championships while they were playing at their highest level. Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker did nothing more but help extend Duncan's prime and his productivity into his late 30s. But that's really it, because if Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker were really as great as some of you all claim them to be, then Tim Duncan could have pulled a Kareem, sat back, chilled, let his numbers decline, and allowed a player like, I don't know, Magic Johnson or James Worthy to take over the franchise and lead them into more finals appearances. Same thing with Shaq and D Wade. Same thing with Wilt Chamberlain and Jerry West. There have been multiple players, especially big men, who have been able to decline statistically as they got older while allowing other players to show up in pivotal moments so they can continue to receive a certain amount of success. However, when Tim Duncan tried to do that, they went a full 7 years without winning anything of significance. So no, you can't sit here and make an argument of someone having too much help around them in reference to Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili when you have Magic Johnson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar on the same team with one another, and they're still sharing a roster with players such as James Worthy, Norm Nixon, and Jamal Wilkes. And then finally, the other side of the argument is Popovich. Now, don't get me wrong, Popovich is one of the greatest coaches of all time. Many people, including myself, will make the argument that he is the greatest coach of all time. However, let me tell you a secret real quick. Very similar to the other Hall of Fame teammates, Popovich wasn't always coaching at an elite level. Now, this right here is one of Popovich's patent offensive schemes. Watch how the ball handler dumps the ball into Duncan, and then everybody just standstills. Look at that. Look at that execution. Look at the X and O master work at its finest. Everybody just standing still. Oh my goodness. If Duncan didn't have Popovich, I don't know how he would be able to score those points. Now here's another example. Watch how the ball is being passed into the post for Tim Duncan. Oh, rewind that. Bring it back for a second. Look at the post position that Popovich drew up for Tim Duncan, and then look at this post-entry pass as well that Popovich drew up. Now, I want you to look at this player movement because it's very, very pivotal. Look at the player movement. Oh my goodness, Popovich is a mastermind. I mean, my goodness, if Popovich wasn't the head coach, I don't know what Tim Duncan would have been able to accomplish. Now, on this play right here, Tim Duncan just makes it more difficult for himself because he gets double teamed. We all know with the amount of Hall of Fame talent that was around Tim Duncan and with Popovich running these sophisticated offensive schemes, there's no way that Tim Duncan should have ever received any double teams whatsoever. So I'm actually going to call fault on Tim Duncan here because that's his fault. But if it wasn't for those Hall of Famers that was surrounding Tim Duncan as well as Popovich, I don't know how they would have been able to even get out of that situation because there's no rhyme or reason why he should have ever even been double teamed to begin with. But for those out there who don't believe me, riddle me this. What happened during the 2000 postseason run? During the 2000 postseason run, Tim Duncan was unavailable to play due to him suffering an injury. However, everything is okay, right? Because of all of that help that was surrounding Tim Duncan. You still got two other Hall of Famers in David Robinson and Greg Popovich, right? In the first round, the San Antonio Spurs will go on to match up against the Phoenix Suns that only featured one Hall of Famer in Jason Kidd. But to make it even easier for the San Antonio Spurs, J. Kidd only played one game during that series since he too was dealing with injuries. Matter of fact, to give you even more details about this Phoenix Suns team, they were so thin at the guard position that they were forced to call Kevin Johnson out of retirement after Jason Kidd was going to be ruled out for a majority of the first round. But yet, some way, somehow, the San Antonio Spurs are unable to pass the Phoenix Suns during this series, despite the fact that the Phoenix Suns were held to 83 points during this 4-game series, as well as shot below 40% from the field, below 30% from behind the arc, and below 70% from the free throw line. So for all the people out there who claim that, Tim Duncan, he had all of that help, well, for whatever reason, all of that help couldn't even make it past the first round of the playoffs while matching up against a team that was missing their best player for majority of a postseason run. More than likely, regardless of how great you think David Robinson was at that stage of his career, as well as Greg Popovich, the San Antonio Spurs would have been at best a first round out if Tim Duncan had not arrived to that team. And the last argument that I want to debunk is this concept that Tim Duncan is lucky that he was drafted to this great situation with the San Antonio Spurs. Now, first and foremost, let me be clear. Tim Duncan was not drafted in a situation like LeBron James, where that's just a god-awful situation. However, to say that he's lucky is a hyperbolic statement. Tim Duncan was drafted to an organization that had little to no history. We're not talking about some storied franchise that won multiple championships. No. Prior to Tim Duncan's arrival, at best, we're talking about an organization that was peaking at a conference finals appearance, led by a player in David Robinson, who in the prior year suffered a career-altering injury, and then the second best player in Sean Elliott was also dealing with injury problems as well, and thanks to a kidney disease that he was diagnosed with early on in his career, not only was his prime shortened, but his entire career was cut short by the early 2000s, when more than likely it could have tailed off towards the mid-2000s. Furthermore, Greg Popovich was basically a rookie head coach because in his first year in the league, he was coaching a team that was trying to tank to position themselves to draft Tim Duncan. And also, let's not forget, as soon as the Spurs drafted Tim Duncan, they needed him to play at an elite level immediately. There are numerous other players throughout NBA history who were drafted to teams in better situations. So much so that it is, again, a hyperbolic statement that anyone would make claims or try to marginalize Tim Duncan's career by saying that he was lucky to be drafted to that situation. And I would further go on to say that that sentiment continues to be true until year 7 or 8 in Duncan's career, where you have both Manu Ginobili and Tony Parker starting to reach their primes. Now, before I end the video, let me just leave you with this. At the end of the day, I am not trying to change your mind on where you should rank Tim Duncan, because it's just your opinion. However, the one thing I have a problem when it comes to ranking players, especially from people who are misinformed, is the lack of consistency that I see when trying to hold player A to a certain standard that they're not holding the rest of the players in their top 10s list to. And so when it comes to Tim Duncan, if you're going to make the argument or try to marginalize what he achieved through his career because he played with quote unquote too much help, then I need to hear that same level of criticism for players such as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Shaquille O'Neal. If you're going to sit here and tell me that Tim Duncan is just lucky because of the situation that he was drafted into, then I need to hear that same energy for players such as Kobe Bryant, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Larry Bird. So with all that being said, leave your comments in the comment section below, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to receive a lot of comments in this video. But until next time, I'll see you all later. Peace.